Think about the last time you went grocery shopping. You picked up the same things you always buy. The same bread, the same eggs, the same chicken. And when you got to the register, the total was higher than it should have been. Again. So you went home and you waited. Because every economist on television and every government official behind every microphone told you the same thing. Be patient. Inflation is temporary. Prices will come back down. That was years ago. The prices did not come back down. And the reason why is not one simple thing. It is a system of overlapping forces. And once you see how it works, you will never look at a grocery receipt the same way again.
To understand why your grocery bill is permanently higher, we need to start with a word that economists use constantly and define, honestly, almost never. That word is inflation. Most people think inflation means prices go up. That is true, but it is only half the picture. The other half, the half that rarely makes it into the evening news, is that inflation means the purchasing power of your money goes down. Permanently. Not temporarily, not until the crisis passes. Permanently. Every percentage point of inflation that occurs is a percentage point of your money's value that is gone. It does not come back when the inflation rate drops back to normal. Dropping back to normal just means prices are rising more slowly again. It does not mean they are falling back to where they were.
This distinction has an enormous real-world consequence that affects every person who buys food. According to the USDA, from 2020 to 2024, the All-Food Consumer Price Index rose 23.6%. That is not a temporary spike that corrected itself. That is a permanent shift in the baseline cost of feeding yourself and your family. In 2022 alone, food prices increased faster than any year since 1979. And while the rate of increase slowed in 2023 and 2024, the prices themselves did not fall back. The new baseline was quietly accepted as just the way things are now. For most goods in most economies, this dynamic is uncomfortable but manageable. Televisions and electronics often get cheaper over time through competition and technology improvements. But food is different. Food is not a luxury. Food is not something you can delay purchasing until prices improve. You need to eat every single day, regardless of what the market is doing. This makes food uniquely vulnerable to permanent price increases in a way that almost no other category of spending is. And it makes the food industry uniquely positioned to maintain elevated prices in ways that go beyond what simple supply and demand alone would explain.
Here is where the story stops being about abstract economics and starts being about the specific structure of the industry that puts food on your table. Because the food you buy at your grocery store does not come from hundreds of competing independent companies, all fighting to offer you the lowest possible price. It comes from a surprisingly small number of enormous corporations that control the production, processing, and distribution of most of what the world eats. Consider this. According to Farm Action and multiple USDA analyses, 4 companies, Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef, control approximately 80 to 85% of the U.S. beef processing market. That is not a rough estimate. That is a figure cited by the USDA itself and confirmed in congressional testimony. A 2021 investigation by The Guardian and Food and Water Watch found that 4 companies or fewer controlled at least 50% of the market for 79% of the grocery items sold in American stores. And at the retail level, Walmart alone accounts for roughly 25% of all grocery sales nationally. What this structure creates is not a competitive market in any traditional sense. It is a series of highly concentrated industries stacked on top of each other, all the way from the farm to your shopping cart. And here is what highly concentrated markets do when inflation gives them cover to raise prices. Research from the Economic Policy Institute found that corporate profits accounted for around 54% of food price increases between 2020 and 2021, compared to only around 11% in the 4 decades before that.
The FTC released a report finding that retail grocery revenues rose to more than 7% above costs in 2023, substantially higher than their previous high of 5.6% in 2015. The FTC's own conclusion was that some firms used rising costs as an opportunity to further increase prices and boost profits, and that those profits remained elevated even after supply chain pressures eased. This behavior has been called greedflation, or profit-led inflation by economists. And importantly, the evidence for it is not just from advocacy groups. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City found that markup growth accounted for more than half of consumer price inflation in 2021, a substantially higher contribution than during the preceding decade. The Groundwork Collaborative, analyzing Commerce Department data, found that corporate profits drove 53% of inflation during the second and third quarters of 2023. It is worth noting that other economists, including researchers at the San Francisco Federal Reserve, have argued that the picture is more complicated and that supply and demand shocks were genuine drivers of much of the initial inflation. The honest answer is that multiple forces were at work simultaneously, and the debate among economists about their relative size is still active. What is much less disputed is the mechanism that keeps prices high after cost pressures ease. When costs fell, companies did not lower their prices back down because consumers had already adjusted their expectations to the new price level. The higher price had become the new anchor. And in a concentrated market with limited genuine competition, there is little structural pressure to bring prices back down.
By 2023, the word greedflation began appearing not just in academic papers, but in congressional hearings, FTC reports, and the public statements of central bankers. Grocery chains in several countries were called before parliamentary committees. In the United States, the FTC launched a study into grocery pricing practices and published findings pointing directly at margin expansion as a primary driver of sustained high prices. In Canada, parliamentary committees publicly confronted major grocery CEOs with their own profit figures. In the United Kingdom, the government introduced a voluntary price cap scheme on basic food items. In Australia, supermarket pricing became a genuine political issue, with both major parties competing to appear tougher on grocery corporations. In every case, the pattern was similar. Public anger was real. Political response was visible. But actual structural change to the food pricing system was limited. And the reason structural change is so difficult to achieve goes directly back to the consolidation itself. When 4 companies control 80 to 85% of beef processing, you cannot simply tell consumers to shop elsewhere. There is no meaningful elsewhere. The market concentration that allowed prices to rise beyond cost pressures is the same market concentration that prevents competitive pressure from bringing them back down. Meanwhile, a second and longer-term pressure is building underneath the immediate pricing story. Climate change is making agriculture more expensive and more unpredictable. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more damaging to crop yields in key growing regions. Water scarcity is affecting farming areas that the global food system depends on heavily. The avian flu outbreak that began in 2022 alone caused egg prices to surge dramatically, rising 32.2% in 2022 and then again 21.9% in 2025, demonstrating how fragile modern concentrated agricultural supply chains are to biological disruption. The structural cost of producing food is rising in ways that have nothing to do with corporate decisions and everything to do with the physical conditions under which food must be grown and raised.
So here is the full and honest picture of why your grocery bill is not going back to where it was. It is not one single villain, and it is not one single cause. It is 3 distinct forces operating simultaneously and reinforcing each other. The first is monetary. Inflation permanently shifted the price baseline upward. According to the USDA, the all-food CPI rose 23.6% between 2020 and 2024 alone. That purchasing power is not coming back. The second is structural. The concentration of the food industry into a small number of very powerful corporations created conditions where profit margins expanded during an inflationary period and have stayed expanded because competitive pressure in a consolidated market is too weak to force them back down. The third is environmental. The long-term cost of producing food is rising because the physical conditions of agriculture are becoming more expensive and less predictable, from extreme weather to disease outbreaks to water scarcity. None of these three forces is temporary. None of them is likely to reverse on its own in the near term. Which means the real question is not whether grocery prices will return to where they were. The evidence from the USDA, the FTC, the Federal Reserve, and multiple independent research institutions all points in the same direction on that one. They will not. The real question is how fast they will continue rising, and whether the people and systems responsible for managing that rise will be transparent about what is actually driving it. Understanding this does not immediately fix your grocery bill, but it tells you exactly where to look when you are trying to understand why your money buys less than it used to. And it separates the real structural causes from the simplified explanations that tend to dominate the conversation. The food on your table connects to some of the most consequential economic forces operating in the world right now. This channel exists to make those connections visible and to explain them in language that does not require an economics degree. Subscribe, because the next video pulls on the thread that connects everything you just learned to the company that most people have never heard of, but that influences the price of almost everything you eat.